Welcome to the Eddie Hyatt Podcast. I'm your host and teacher, Eddie Hyatt. So glad you've joined me here on this Monday morning. We're continuing our teachings in our series in Paul's letter to the church in Ephesus. And today we're going to skip ahead to chapter 5. We'll come back to the other chapters and verses, but we're going to skip ahead to chapter 5, chapter 6 and verse 5. Because a friend who is a regular listener to this podcast and also a friend and supporter of our ministry asked if we would comment on Paul's statement in Ephesians 6:5 for slaves to be obedient to their masters. The King James says servants. I'm looking at the New King James says bondservants. It's the Greek word douloi, which was a word for slaves. Be obedient to your masters. So the question is, does the Bible advocate or affirm slavery? Well, right up front, the answer is no. And to arrive at a clear picture of what we're talking about, there are several things that I want to look at. I want to look at some of the scriptures that give us the overall picture of liberty and freedom taught by Jesus in the New Testament, but also want to put it into the historical and cultural context of the time in which Paul was writing. First of all, we need to realize that slavery has been a worldwide part of humanity for all of recorded history. All kinds of peoples and civilizations have practiced slavery for all of human history. Like the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Greeks, the Armenians, the Arabs throughout the continent of Africa and Asia, the Middle East. Slavery has been practiced all over the world by all kinds of peoples. Now, we who are Americans here in the United States, because of the tragic history of slavery here in America, we sometimes are left to think that slavery is something unique to America. No, slavery has been a part of human history. That's why Dr. Walter Williams, the late Dr. Walter Williams, who was a brilliant intellectual and the professor of economics at um, uh, George Mason University, that's why he said that slavery in America was neither odd or unusual. He said what was odd or unusual about slavery in America was the moral outrage that arose against it. We'll talk about that more later. But I might just mention this, that the English word slave actually came from the word Slav or Slavic. The Slavic people are an ethnicity, ethnic people, ethnicity, especially in Europe, found in countries such as Poland, Serbia, Bosnia, the Czech Republic, Ukraine, and even in Russia. Now, the Muslim Ottoman Empire conquered Constantinople, which was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire in 1453. The Muslim Ottomans captured Constantinople and conquered the eastern sector of the Roman Empire. And they enslaved millions of Eastern Europeans, especially the Slavic peoples were especially targeted for slaves. And some estimate as many as 6 million of the Eastern Europeans, uh, made up mostly of the Slavic people, were enslaved by the Ottoman Empire. And so there were so many of the Slavic people that were enslaved that this is where we get the English word slave. When Paul was writing in the first century, slavery was very much part of the Roman Empire. Um, some estimate that one half the population of the city of Rome were slaves, and that 30% of Italy, of course, that's where Rome is located, of Italy were slaves, and that throughout the empire, as much as 10 or 20% were slaves. Now, of course, slavery had nothing to do with race. Uh, much of it was from peoples areas, tribes that the Romans had conquered, and they would enslave people, especially the ones that they thought could be helpful to them. And then people were born into slavery, and slavery became something perpetual, even in families and so on. And so it was a part of the times. It was a part of Roman law. It was a part of the culture. And so when Paul wrote his letter to Ephesians, now let us put ourselves in Paul's place for just a moment in writing his letter. Think about writing a letter, say, to the Christians in Iran who are under Sharia law, and where it is a crime to openly preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. If you were writing a letter to a group of Christians, even today in Iran, you would not tell the women, "Oh, get rid of that head covering." You wouldn't tell the people, "Oh, yeah, get out there on the streets and tell people about Jesus." You would try to help them, yes, warn them that because of their testimony, if it comes down to it, they could lose their lives. But you would try to help them to negotiate their way through that difficult culture and laws under which they live. And this is the challenge that Paul has. He's trying to help the people to negotiate their way to be good Christians, to be a witness for Jesus within the culture and the Roman laws and things of which they are living under. Now, I need to also say this: slavery came into the world at the time of the fall. It's a part of sin. Sin and slavery go right together, but it is just one of so many sins. It's a horrible sin, but it's just one of many sins. And so when Jesus came into the world, he came to deal with the root of sin. Yeah, there's all kinds of fruit. There's all kinds of outgrowths of sin, but unless the root is dealt with, there will be no change. It's like if you got weeds in your yard, you can mow them, but they're going to grow right back and grow faster than your grass. If you want to get rid of them, you've got to uproot them. And so the the message of the New Testament, because of how slavery was so ingrained and it was a part of the laws of the Romans and everything, Paul is not going to tell them, "Yeah, I want you to, gather up some swords and things and go out." No, that would have destroyed themselves. It would have destroyed the testimony of the gospel. So he's going to encourage them to live in such a way that they can be a light and a witness while the gospel has time to work and work its power and change hearts and lives and deal with slavery right at the root of the problem. Now, American missionaries had this issue back in the early 1900s, and I heard African missionary, a missionary to Africa, whose father was a missionary to Africa before him, and he spent many years in Africa, tell about that in the early days, in some particular part of Africa where they practiced polygamy, that many of the people they came to Christ. And so the American missionaries immediately told them, "You can't have more than one wife. You're going to have to get rid of some of them." And so the men started, they kept the one they liked the best, and they kicked all of the others out with their children. Well, I mean, it caused all kinds of problems. Here were these women with children. They have no food to eat. They're out on the streets. They're desperate. They don't know what to do. Some so desperate they turn to prostitution. Others are begging and so on. So all of a sudden they realize, hey, we're going to have to deal with this differently. We're going to have to leave this part of their culture, although it's not the way it ought to be. we're going to have to leave it, and we're going to have to teach them and train them and teach the new generation so that the gospel takes root and it deals with this whole situation at the very root of the problem. And this is what the gospel message is going to do, because the gospel message is a message of freedom. Jesus said it in uh, Ephesians 4:18 that he had come to proclaim liberty to the captives. And in Ephesians chapter 8, I was just reading this just a few minutes ago. Let me see if I can turn over to this quickly. John chapter 8, very, very powerful message where Jesus said, Assuredly I say to you, whoever commits sin is a slave of sin. Now that's the first slave master that he wants us to be free from. Because until we get free from the slave master of sin, we're not going to be able to get free from all kinds of things that hold us into bondage. And so Jesus said, Assuredly I say to you, whoever commits sin is a slave of sin. And a slave does not abide in the house forever, but a son abides forever. Therefore, if the Son makes you free, talking about himself, you will be free indeed. I'm going to have to stop there, but we're going to continue tomorrow talking about how the gospel message dealt with slavery and how it's actually been the Christian message that has uprooted slavery in America, in Britain, and around the world. I'm Eddie Hyatt. This is the Eddie Hyatt Podcast. If you'd like to read a little book I wrote along these lines about slavery in America and how it was Christianity, a great awakening, a revival of Christianity in the 1700s that unleashed the spiritual and moral forces that brought about an end to slavery. It's in a little book called Abolitionist Founding Fathers. Abolitionist Founding Fathers. It's on my website. It's also on Amazon. Be a great blessing to you, especially with July the 4th coming up. And we'll continue our discussion tomorrow. God bless.